the notion of economic and social and cultural rights, as opposed to freedom from torture and these other issues, is more of an aspiration than a reality. And it's, of course, the hardest of these ones to actually realize. So, what you see then in this document, and I'll talk about, move to something else at this moment after this, is just to say, look, it begins with these general principles. It talks about these individual rights. It talks about the rights of individuals in political and civic society. And then it talks about these rights, these larger social, economic, and cultural rights. So in some sense, it's a summation of this history that we've been talking about, with an explicit purview, including not man, but disaggregating man into man and woman, with no categories. Okay. Is that clear? And it actually also, and I don't have time to talk about this, it talks about not just states, but other sort of international, everyone needs to recognize this. State bodies, non-governmental, I mean, it becomes a general universal principle. Well, what does it say about sovereignty? And this is, it says about sovereignty. Well, what the article says, it's a complicated claim. The UN is based on a European system of sovereignty. That is to say, it's based on the post-Westphalia system, which says that no state should intervene in the claims of any other state. Remember, we talked about that notion of sovereignty earlier. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, it obligates states to act if other states, who are signatories, contravene certain standards, among them genocide, crimes of war, and crimes against humanity. That is to say, in some sense, it maintains sovereignty in the notion of the Westphalian system, but it's not sovereignty as it used to be, because it says that it says there's now an obligation to oppose sovereign rights and immunities when a sovereign state violates particular standards. That's another hugely important step. It's a step that we talked about. We talked with Sarah Mohammed, in the legal doctrine. So the UN has it both ways. Everyone understood that it had it both ways. It went forward having it both ways. And that produces, in my view, not the utopia of human rights, as Sam Moyn calls it, but actually the politics of human rights in the world as it exists today. So that's now before, should we stop here for a second? Questions? Questions? Okay. I take this as assent. Fish? No? All right. So I want to talk about the three documents in your reader, but I just want to point out that more or less at the same time, or at the same time, actually the day before, the UN passes a Convention for Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. So it's this moment when genocide becomes a crime. And as you'll recall, when we saw the Nuremberg movie, they started mumbling around about genocide. There was no crime called genocide. And Raphael Lemkin, whom you read a bit of, insisted that there actually is a crime that's different just than crimes against humanity. It's a crime directed against the destruction of a people, not just physically, but culturally and morally and socially. And that crime needed to be recognized by the UN. And that became one of the crimes that became the grounds for national intervention in the affairs of another country. Indeed, an obligation under the genocide conventions that passed later to intervene in countries where this was going on. Now, does it happen? It does not always happen, and we'll discuss this when we talk about Rwanda. But in 1948, at the same time as the Universal Declaration of the Rights of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there was also a declaration that made it as a crime to make this a crime. This may be the most heinous of the crimes against human rights. So, in that sense, 1948 is a kind of beginning of the international arena of this jurisprudence and culture that we've been talking about. And this is a thing actually which was signed by all European countries. In other words, the Soviet bloc signed on to the Genocide Convention. Okay, so that's what I want to tell you about the Universal Declaration and its ancillary treaties. Is that okay so far? So let me just briefly then talk to you about Fanon. So this is Frantz Fanon. He was a Algerian psychoanalyst and Marxist theorist. It tells you something about the cultural milieu. Both of his books, Black Skin, White Masks, and The Wretched of the Earth, were written in French. So in some sense, the voice, the kind of masking that he argues against was a masking that he himself participated in, and what he wants to argue in this is that in itself, colonialism is a violation of human rights and dignity, is a fundamental wrong, a fundamental dehumanization, and that the way to resolve this is not, and here he's being critical of his fellow intellectual, is not to negotiate with the colonial powers, not to try to be like the Europeans, right? But instead to actually overthrow the world. And in overthrowing the world, he takes clearly the model of a Marxist revolution. So the first, he says, what we really literally need to do, he says, is the first shall be last. And to make the first, first last, one has to speak in the same language as those who made the others first, which is the language of force. He wants to argue that just as the worker is deeply alienated under capitalism from the means of production, so the colonial subject is deeply alienated from himself, is masked, is not real to himself. He develops this as a psychoanalyst who studies the violence done by Algerians, not to the West, but to each other. And he says this is a pathology produced in these people by colonialism, and that the way to change this, he keeps saying, is through violence. It's through the impetuous and the compelling, through changing consciousness. The colonial world, he wants to say, is a Manichaean world. It's a world of black and white. So there's no room for the notion of human rights and negotiations and so forth. It's an existential struggle. The settler paints the native as the quintessence of evil. The only way to overthrow it is for for the colonial to see the settler as the quintessence of evil. So it's a radical revolutionary program that's aimed at often this sort of program is as a kind of as a sort of liberatory moment, an overthrowing of the white man's values by the colonized values. So that does speak to your point. It's not human rights, and this whole liberal discourse is basically fundamentally on the wrong side of this black-white divide. Is what Fanon argues. Now, this was an important. He was an important writer. He was an important writer in the period, and he was much read in radical circles all over the world, including radical circles in this country. He was widely translated, and he was a proponent of a movement called negritude, that there was a special sort of black consciousness and political place in the world that should include other sorts of people, and of a particular colonial subjectivity, which ought to be radically different from Western colonial subjectivities. So this was an important person, and the Declaration of the Rights, the Universal Declaration, was born into this world. So I don't want to deny its importance. I think you can read it yourself and discuss it in section, think about whether you think this is reasonable. But I would suggest, my own view, is that it has the kind of utopian radicalism which you read about in some sense in the Koestler book that you read. It's a translations of that into colonial context by a person who could only have had these thoughts by himself, and he gets this, taking on the mask of the West. These are thoughts of a westernized person. So in some sense, this is him also struggling with himself, with his complicity, with his notion that a voice comes from Paris and he hears the voice of classicism, the voice of French. So that's the one text. Now, I wanted you guys to read the other text, which is the text of this Bandung Conference, which was held in Indonesia in 1955, and which was the sort of moment in which the so-called Third World Movement, the movement of the non-aligned, came into being. Now, I wanted you to read this, and again, read the article. You don't have to read every word of it. And if you ever take an international relations course, you'll get there lots of subtleties and ins and outs and all this sort of this material. But the important point of this thing I want to show you is you look at these people, these delegates. These are not all European guys. They're people from all over the world. And what I want to point out to you is, I ask you to look specifically at pages 608 to 611 of your reader when you look at this. That these delegates don't see the problem so much as the West versus them. They see that the West has sometimes abandoned them in the context of human rights. They say, for example, that René Cassin, one of the authors of the Universal Declaration, is claiming that we can't enforce these human rights ideals in the Third World because they might endanger public order and because different